a transportation resource. We felt it was important to educate individuals with IDD on transportation services in their area because family and friends may not always be available to provide transportation. Mental health and wellness. The YLC hosted a panel to discuss the unique mental health and wellness challenges in the IDD community. For me, being born with mild cerebral palsy means I rely on a walker and a wheelchair. One of the challenges I experience is accessing mental health services. As a future marriage and family therapist, I dreamed of having a private practice. As a result, I decided to complete my 20 hours of personal psychotherapy by choosing a counselor in private practice. Unfortunately, all the offices where I live were located on the second floor. They did not have elevators. From what I understand, this is not a requirement for private practices. In the end, I had to rely on my mom to drive me 30 to 60 minutes away to complete these hours. The YouTube initiative. One of my tasks on the YouTube initiative is to edit the captions. Automated captions are great, but they are not perfect. It's really important to check these captions. Make sure the information matches what the person is saying in the video. This helps people who read the captions understand the information being presented. YLC accomplishments. The first YLC accomplishment that I will talk about is accessibility, the 5-star friendship walk standards. The YLC conducted a survey exploring accessibility at participants, chapters, and events sponsored by Best Buddies. We found that accessibility issues at chapters and events sponsored by Best Buddies were two completely different issues. For chapters, all participants are able to physically access the event. However, issues arise typically during activities. Many physically disabled individuals were having a hard time participating due to the activity. Instead of having difficulties accessing the event or venue, our survey also found that many physically disabled participants have a wide range of difficulties when attending friendship walks due to the location chosen for the events. Based on this information, the YLC generated an accessibility project proposal outlining short-term and long-term steps to improve friendship walks accessibility standards. Following a meeting with Best Buddies International, it has been stated they will be adopting measures from our proposal. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. The YLC has secured a spot on the Best Buddies International new DE&I committee. The members of the YLC plan to utilize this new opportunity to bring forth the voice of Best Buddies participants. Model UN. Model UN hosts a number of conferences throughout the year, and they have graciously invited the YLC to participate in many of them. These opportunities have allowed members of the YLC in international stage to speak out against the hardships that still live within the IDD community.
Awesome. Thanks, Vanessa, for sharing a little bit more about the YLC. So now we're going to move on to the main topic for today's presentation, which, if you recall, the title of the presentation is The Path to Global Accessibility. And later on, we're going to hear from the amazing presenters about accessibility in different avenues of just daily life. But before we do that, I want to give a quick rundown of what we mean when we say accessibility, and especially thinking about this new concept called universal accessibility, which we'll talk a little bit. Okay, so first let's look at the definition of accessibility. So, dictionary definition. Accessibility is when the needs of people with disabilities are specifically considered, and products, services, and facilities are built or modified so that they can be used by people of all abilities. So I don't know about you guys, but personally, accessibility has always been one of those big concepts that maybe I thought about, but I hadn't considered the very specific definition. And so I think this is just a little bit handy to have in the back of our minds while we're thinking about universal accessibility, which is the bigger question that I want to pose today. What is the difference between accessibility and universal accessibility? And so to you, that might sound like the same thing, except one of them sounds, I don't know, maybe more like a Star Trek concept or something. But there is actually a big difference between the two, and I want to go over why the difference is so important when we're thinking about how to apply accessibility in our daily living. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a graphic that I want to spend a little bit of time talking through so that we can all be on the same page. So you guys might recognize this from the picture book, The Giving Tree. There were different versions of this graphic online, but I picked this one because Giving Tree is a personal favorite. Okay, but we have two children. I'm going to call the one on the left Tom. I'm going to call the one on the right Jerry. Totally coincidental names. But okay, so Tom and Jerry are hungry and they want to get an apple from the apple tree. So let's look at the top left box with the big word inequality. So if we look, we see that the tree is leaning closer to Tom. And so he is able to get an apple more easily than Jerry is able to get an apple. And so that shows inequality where some people might have unequal access to opportunities compared to other people. In this case, Jerry does not have as much of an opportunity to get an apple as Tom does. So obviously that is something wrong. And we can translate that to our society when we think about people with intellectual or developmental disabilities who might not have as many opportunities compared to individuals who don't have IDD. So let's go to the next box, which is the top right one with the bolded word equality. So if we look now, both Tom and Jerry have been given a ladder so that they can reach the apple tree a little bit easier. But if we look closely, we'll see that Tom and Jerry were given a ladder that is the same height. So that initially sounds like it's fair, but that becomes a problem because the tree is leaning towards Tom. So with his ladder, Tom is able to reach the apples. But if we look at Jerry, Jerry is still not able to reach the apples because the tree had been leaning away from him. And so the ladder is still not high enough for him to get the apples. So that shows equality where opportunities might be evenly distributed, but it still doesn't help people who might need a little bit more support in society. So let's look at the bottom left picture. And now we see that Jerry has been given a little bit higher of a ladder than Tom, which is a step closer to the solution because now they can both reach the apples and they can both go home and make their apple pie. So this shows equity because there are custom tools that are personalized to everyone's needs and they can still get the apples or the opportunities. But there's an even better solution, and that is the final picture, justice. And in this picture, we see that the tree itself has been adjusted so that Tom and Jerry can reach the apples with the same size ladder. And so we can see that this is different from equality because in equality, Tom and Jerry were given the same size ladders, and that didn't help when the tree was still leaning. And this is different from equity because in equity, the boys were given the ladders, but the tree was still leaning towards Tom. Justice is the best solution because the tree itself is fixed. So now we won't need to give Jerry a taller ladder than Tom. Okay, so that was a lot of word vomiting, but it relates to accessibility and universal acceptance because accessibility is related to equity, where a person an individual with IDD might be given tools that are personalized to them. And that is still important. And that's not something we want to take away in our society. But universal accessibility or acceptance is when the system or our society itself is fixed so that we might not even need to have as many personalized tools, like the needs of individuals with IDD are already considered within society itself. Okay, so that was, yes, a lot of word vomit. Let's sum this all up so that we're all on the same page on the next slide. Okay, to sum up, accessibility is when the needs of people with disabilities are specifically considered. Universal accessibility is the design of buildings, products, or environments, which will be discussed by later presenters, to make them accessible to all people, regardless of age, disability, or other factors. Okay, so it might help to think about some examples. So we have some examples on the next slide. Okay, so an example. I want you guys to think about this as an exercise. I know that we're not going to talk. I can't talk with you guys right now, but in your head, let's take a few moments. Which picture would represent accessibility and which one would represent universal accessibility? So hopefully you guys said that the picture on the left represents accessibility and the picture on the right represents universal accessibility. And for those of you who aren't as clear, why is that? So the picture on the left represents accessibility because we can see that the woman, she uses a wheelchair for transportation. And so outside the building, there is a button for people with a wheelchair. They can press it and the door will open for them to enter. So that is accessibility because her needs are specifically considered. And those needs are still very important. And in scenarios where we can't have universal accessibility, we still need those tools for individuals with IDD to navigate the world. But in the picture on the right is universal accessibility because the doors are automatically opening doors, which means that anyone with IDD or without IDD would be able to enter and use the automatic doors in the same way. And so that's an example of universal accessibility. On the next slide, we have another example. And this is something that Vanessa was mentioning when she was talking about the YouTube initiative, which is subtitles. Subtitles are an example of universal accessibility because anyone, regardless of whether they are hard of hearing or possibly deaf, would be able to watch this video using the subtitles. And so that's an example of universal accessibility as well. So that was a lot of information, but I hope you guys understand, first of all, the difference between accessibility and universal accessibility and why universal accessibility is so important.
So next I'll be talking about what is the history of accessibility. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. He was the first U.S. president with a visible disability. He was in a wheelchair most of the time, but he often tried to hide from the public view. If you look it up on Google, there's a lot of images that show he tried to control his image so that it didn't look like he was in a wheelchair. This was all due to stigma. People often saw people with disabilities as inferior or incapable of doing tasks. The people with disabilities could do. That people without disabilities could do, I apologize. Although it was a great step in progress that Franklin Roosevelt was elected president as someone with a disability, it's sad that he had to hide it because of the stigma. Next slide. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was passed. This prohibited discrimination in federal programs and services, so disabled activists led sit-ins and protests to help get this act passed. This is another big leap of progress for the disabled community because it put into law the prohibition of discrimination, which is really, really important. In 1974, 1 year later, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA Act, was passed. This act allowed for non-discrimination policies in public schools, so making sure that every student has a right to education regardless of any disabilities they might have. A really big event that was super important in the disabilities rights movement is called the Capitol Crawl. This happened in March 1990. There was a huge push among different politicians and a lot of disabled activists for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, to be passed. This act essentially would declare everyone equal under law, help make a lot of things more accessible for people with disabilities. So one of the huge demonstrations that happened to help push this law to be passed was called the Capitol Crawl. Basically, a lot of disabled and non-disabled activists showed up to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They showed just how inaccessible the stairs out front were. This was a bigger metaphor for their push for making spaces more accessible, making the country more accessible. If you Google Capitol Crawl, one of the images you will see is a disabled activist climbing up the steps, showing just how difficult it is for some people with certain disabilities to do certain things without reasonable accommodations. So this caught a lot of media attention and ultimately led to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. In essence, this law prohibits discrimination based on disability in employment, services rendered by the state and local government, places of public accommodation, transportation, and telecommunication services. Businesses were mandated to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities. Public services could no longer deny services to people with disabilities. They are expected to have modifications to make accessibility more common. Their mandate for adaptive services for people with disabilities. So essentially, a lot of accommodations we see today, such as hallways need to be a certain width so that wheelchairs can get through. Buildings need to have elevators. The ADA is an act to research more about because it's so pivotal in the fight for disability rights. Next slide. So next I'll be talking about what does accessibility look like in the classroom. Next slide. These 9 tips come from the conversations we have had with Best Buddies participants with disabilities and their experiences and things they feel would help them and others. Tip number 1, have your members fill out a survey with their accessibility needs. This will help you plan ahead, which is really important. It's good for you to be proactive. Get all your members' information if they're comfortable sharing their accessibility needs. This will help you plan your events ahead of time. This will also help make sure those needs are taken into account. It's also easier than having to plan right before the event. So if your members are comfortable sharing, definitely try to get that information. Tip number 2, for out-of-school events and outings, make sure you look at the venue ahead of time. If you see someone sitting by themselves, go sit with them. More often than not, individuals with cerebral palsy and mobility devices are sitting by themselves because there is a barrier preventing them from socializing with others. For example, grass or not enough space between rows in a classroom. Tip number 3, talk to your advisor ahead of time to make sure you're not forgetting anything. Tip number 4, next slide. Have multiple ways to communicate event logistics ahead of time. Tip number 5, have someone translate messages and communications home in other languages. This is really important because when we're talking about accessibility, we're not just talking about disabilities, we are talking about languages as well. Making sure that all members and their families can access your communications is super important. For example, if you're sending home a flyer, have someone in your school who is a foreign language teacher translate it. Send that translated flyer home to that member and their family. This is a really easy way to make sure everyone is truly included, that your events are accessible for all. Tip number 6, have captions for any videos that you show or have an ASL interpreter at the event. When I was in high school, I had a classmate who communicated through ASL. Our teacher taught us sign language. I know that the student enjoyed every opportunity she had to talk to us directly instead of through an interpreter. Personally, I love learning new things every day. So learning ASL was a really neat experience and a skill I have been able to use throughout life. Tip number 7, use large print for any forms or PowerPoint presentations. This is helpful for people who have visual disabilities and cannot see super small print, but it's also helpful for everyone. When you see large print, it stands out to you more. It's easier to read. Like many of these tips, they are not just helpful for people with disabilities, they are helpful for everyone. When you make your events more accessible for people with disabilities, you're actually making them more accessible for the whole group. So this is something super easy that you can do that's just going to make everyone's experience a whole lot easier and better. Tip number 8, have a sensory-friendly option or a room at an event and be mindful of sensory conditions. Avoid flashing lights or strobe lights. Be mindful of how loud the music is. Flashing lights and strobe lights can be really overwhelming for some people. They can also induce seizures for people who have epilepsy, so maybe just try to avoid those. You can still have a fun dance party without using flashing lights or strobe lights. It will still be a great experience for everyone. Also, when playing music, be mindful of how loud the music is. Being mindful of where the speaker is located. Having options where people can dance and participate without being super close to loud music or bright lights. And tip number 9, for games or activities, explain the instructions verbally and have a written or printed copy available for members to read. For more information on these tips, I highly encourage everyone to subscribe to the Best Buddies YLC YouTube channel and check out our video on ways you can make your events more accessible.
Hi, now I'm going to talk about what does accessibility look like in city planning. So on the next slide, I want you to imagine you're making your way to the city, specifically the city of Champions or Boston, for the first time ever. You feel the skyscrapers and their glowing lights blaring in your face as you make your way down the crowded streets. But now imagine, you're in a wheelchair and you remember Boston is a colonial city with many cobblestone streets. You struggle to get enough momentum to continue on with your friends down the cobblestone. And when you finally get moving, you risk falling over. You now live with the constant fear of tipping your wheelchair over day to day. Imagine you and your friends finally make it to a parking garage after a night out where your car is parked. But soon enough, you realize the space is too tight for you to squeeze through. Now, you must ask your friends to help carry you in. For Maya Palm, a University of Massachusetts Amherst student, this is her life. Focusing strictly on the city of Boston, I want to bring to light some of its inaccessible aspects. So on the next slide, I just want to mention how the crosswalk leading from the Boston Commons, which is a famous, beautiful public park in downtown, to the front gate of the Capitol building, or the home of the state government, has no ramp and has an actual sign that literally says, "Welcome to the State House, watch your step on the curb and tread carefully on the uneven bricks." This restricts anyone with a physical disability affecting mobility from experiencing these city landmarks. In addition to that, not all MBTA T-stops are accessible, and even the famous hop-on, hop-off tours like the duck boats in Boston, which give tourists an in-depth view of the city, have 1/3 of their locations inaccessible to those with a physical disability. Boston is a city with amazing history, but with that comes outdated architecture and building structures. Many streets are extremely narrow and uneven with brick or cobblestone. This means wheelchair users or anyone who uses mobility aids are not able to easily experience the rich culture strictly because of their disability, which is extremely unfair. Recently, I read a story about a Bostonian named Michael Mue. He is a wheelchair user and struggles to get his wheelchair up the curbs of the city. He says that many times he is forced to just roll along the streets since he cannot get up on the sidewalk, and drivers will actually honk at him and tell him to get out of the way. He had a great quote in the article that I read, and it says, "Disability itself isn't a problem. It's the systems like sidewalks and other things that are a problem when they're not accepting disability as a common, natural life occurrence that it is." And this is true because in Boston, it has been 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act was approved by a federal judge. This was a settlement in which the city of Boston promised to ensure all curb ramps met the ADA specifications. As of now, less than half of the city's curb ramps currently meet that standard. Let me repeat that. Less than half of the city's curb ramps meet that standard. Recently, Michael Mue actually fought with the city and has gotten the city to give an extra $25 million to improve the curb ramps throughout the city. So hopefully, less than half will become 100% by 2030. This fight is the start to an all-embracing community. Along with this good news of Michael Mue, Boston has already begun its promise and funded and hired its first ADA coordinator who is focused on street capital improvements. The city also expanded investment and oversight of sidewalk and curb ramp construction projects and has included $57 million and a $25 million increase, thanks to Michael, to meet its construction obligations under the proposed settlement in its recently passed 5-year capital plan. Additionally, the city started its survey and transition plan to ensure all ramps are brought into the ADA compliance. And this is not just in Boston, but many cities across the world are similar, where they have barriers that make living in a city extraordinarily difficult for those with a disability. These include blocked wheelchair ramps, buildings with no elevators or escalators, public bathrooms which are difficult to navigate and make it to, and stores with no step-free access, and more. More change is coming though. And on the next slide, fortunately enough, in cities around the world, people are recognizing the need for inclusiveness, especially since soon enough, 15% of city livers will need accommodations for a disability. These changes include many, but I want to highlight a few quick examples. Seattle has a sidewalk mapping app called Access Map, which gives users the opportunity to enter their desired destination. And in return, the user will receive different routes describing uphill and downhill paths. It'll tell the user where larger curbs will be, as well as which paths are paved in the case of the use of an assisted device. It also uses green and red system, which categorizes the streets into flat and hilly areas, making grounds with a slope over 10% red. In the future, it is hoping to achieve the addition of pavement width and location of handrails too for those with a disability. In Singapore, they have a goal of making the city inclusive throughout its buildings and architecture. Singapore has created low concierge counters and column-free spaces in the majority of the establishments in their central business district. They have also put induction loops, braille directions, and pictographs in all their transportation systems. In Sonoma, which is a city in California, architects have created a project to promote a sense of calm in this bustling city. Their intent is to reduce anxiety for those hypersensitive to sound, light, and movement. The designs for structures are very simple and unornamented, and noise is reduced through quiet heating and ventilation. The natural light and reduction of stimulation that Sonoma has incorporated into its community has allowed many more people with a sensitivity to bustling cities the ability to move in and create a successful life there. So though these are all amazing initiatives in a great start to an all-embracing world, there's still a lot left to do for our future. Many people do not realize all the little things that make living in a city with a disability that much harder. As a society, we take for granted how easily some of us can transport around, etc. And As one kind, we must make changes and start now. Everyone whose destiny is brought to a city deserves to freely access all parts of it and to be given the platform to become the best versions of themselves there. So on the next slide, unfortunately, one of our presenters, Jamie Glavin, could not make it today, but I'm here to share her story about accessibility within the workplace. So what does accessibility look like in the workplace? So did you know that 81% of adults 18 and over with intellectual and developmental disabilities do not have a job in their community? Jamie was one of them. It took Jamie a long time to look for a job, almost close to a year. Without a job, she talked about how she was bored at home and often felt very down. She was in need of a schedule to follow and a feeling of purpose. She went to a bunch of interviews and kept looking online, and she felt as though she really tried everything. Only 19% of people with disabilities are employed, and luckily enough, Jamie is one of them. Being employed, Jamie says, has made her feel fulfilled. She now has a schedule to follow, objectives, goals, and personal money saved for herself. She said it has made her feel real and that she's no longer waiting for something to do. She's insanely proud of her independence within the workplace. Having a job has not only allowed her to meet new people, but has strengthened her interpersonal and problem-solving skills. Jamie said that as fortunate as she is to be employed, she's still angered by the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that says that people with disabilities are legally allowed to be paid below minimum wage. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25, which means workers with a disability can be paid any amount less than that. Some minimum wage is allowed under Section 14C, which is meant to encourage employers to hire certain individuals that are impaired by physical or mental disabilities so that they do not lose out on employment opportunities. Though this does not have a malicious intent, it causes malicious effects. Those with IDD are trapped in a never-ending cycle of low wages and the inability to support themselves off of that. According to the 2020 Sub-Minimum Wage Report, the U.S. Department of Labor estimates that 100,000 people with disabilities are employed at places that are paying them less than the minimum wage. Based on the 2018 census data, less than 40 million people with disabilities live in the U.S., which makes up 12% of the total population. And in 2018, only 35% of people with disabilities were employed. The report also revealed that between 2017 and 2018, the average wage of a person with a disability is $3.34 per hour, working on an average of 16 hours a week. That adds up to only $53.44 per week and $213.44 a month. $213.44 a month. There must be a change and a revolution demanding equality and equity among all wage earners. Though Jamie could not make it today, I want to thank her for sharing her story and her insights on accessibility throughout the workforce. Thank you.
Now I'm going to be sharing my story. As previously mentioned, I was born with mild cerebral palsy. One common misconception is being diagnosed with CP means the entire brain is damaged. This is not true. For me, cerebral palsy impacts my ability to walk. As a result, I rely on mobility devices such as a walker for short distances and a wheelchair for long distances. Something that the viewers might not know about me is I am unemployed. I have been submitting resumes and participating in interviews for 10 years. I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a lot of volunteer experiences. The past 10 years have taught me it doesn't matter how much education or volunteer experience I have. What I really need is someone who's going to see beyond my walker or my wheelchair and give me a chance. Before the pandemic, I was riding the bus 2 hours a day. A one-way trip is a half hour for a pickup and 1.5 hours for a drop-off. The pandemic has taught us that many jobs can be done at home. I truly believe one of the ways we can close the unemployment gap for people with disabilities is by offering remote employment opportunities. For the past year, I have been working with the YLC to make this possible. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you all so much for listening to our presentation on the Global Path to Accessibility. Unfortunately, we can't do any live questions because this is recorded, but feel free to reach out to us if you do have any questions. In the YLC, of course. Yeah, thank you.
Did anyone have any questions or anything? Vanessa and I are here to answer any questions that anyone may have. Yeah, Ryan, go ahead and just unmute if you have a question.
I do. First, I want to say great job on the presentation, and I thought that the presentation on acceptability was great, and everything, and so great job, y'all. I got question. How long did it take for y'all to come up with the with all the ideas about accessibility?
So we originally started the our path or journey with accessibility back in August. It was brought to our attention that some of our physically disabled participants weren't able to navigate some of our venues as much. And so that kind of initiated the conversation there. And since around August, we've just kind of been on a full fledge of trying to improve accessibility guidelines and standards in the organization. And we were fortunate to present this presentation to you guys and have our YLC members show off what they can do. Oh, I think you're
Ryan,
muted.
you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Yes, I thought that was great, and because especially that I was on the YLC for 2 years, and as one of the proud YLC alumni, and so yes, so and thank you all for the great presentation today.
Well, thank
You're
you
welcome.
for coming.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we also wanted to let you guys know, like, we're the YLC, but if you guys have any questions about Best Buddies, we're more than happy to answer them as well. Yeah, Ryan. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys could share a little bit about how the YLC goes about encouraging different institutions or places to work towards accessibility.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, my internet went in and out real quick.
Yeah, of course. I was wondering if you guys could share a little bit about the process by which you work with different institutions or organizations to work towards further accessibility.
So the Best Buddies has a bunch of different partnerships with a bunch of different organizations, but our most impactful for around accessibility is with MUN Impact, just with this presentation, and then being able to work with to learn more about the SDGs and trying to formulate that into our mission statement. As for like other like institutions as that way, it'd be kind of like partnering up with some of our staff members in the organization. We have a lot of senior directors and officials in our organization, so working with them collaboratively to put in some guidelines and standards so that we have like a strong foundation when addressing accessibility.
Awesome. Well, I guess kind of linked to that, could you share a little bit about some of the major projects or branches of Best Buddies, and I guess how they relate to improve focusing on the goal of accessibility?
Yeah, Vanessa, did you want to touch on that?
Go ahead, Garrett.
Okay. So like a couple different of like the branches of Best Buddies is we have a jobs program. So Jamie had talked about that. It's our integrated employment program. We have a leadership program, friendship, and also our living program. Our living program is an inclusive living. So it is a location that allows individuals with and without IDD to live in the same unit and same area. And that entire building is chosen around accessibility, and so that we can have more inclusive living practices or living opportunities. Our job, that's they're working on guidelines and standards that help guide, or trainings really that help employers improve their accessibility practices in the workforce and in their organizations. And then with chapters, so that's our friendship. The YLC has created with Vanessa and one of our other co-chair created a checklist for chapter leaders throughout the country to kind of go through to improve their level of accessibility. When we were kind of doing a first initial assessment, we were finding that mainly our accessibility issues were kind of like our venues and events, but we did see a little bit of a struggle of accessibility with our chapters based off of like activities, depending on what the activity or event that they're kind of doing. So shaping the events or the activities around the abilities of individuals attending really kind of improves the accessibility level there. And then of course our last but not least, our leadership. That's just kind of providing more inclusive environments, such as the YLC. We operate in a fully virtual environment. So this kind of takes out a lot of physical barriers, but there are other barriers that come in place, such as Vanessa had talked about with captioning that improves that level of accessibility. But without captioning, that is a barrier for certain individuals or for some individuals. But those are kind of all the different realms and branches that we're kind of addressing accessibility in the organization.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll add is that, or what was I gonna add? Okay, I'll add it later when I remember. But that was a really good explanation, Garrett. I think we had some questions in the chat.
Someone asked how they can get involved.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about that?
Yes. So we have like different programs, and you can be involved like in our friendship program. Actually, Garrett, do you have a link for like where they can check out like international programs? Because I believe most of these people are international in other countries. But there's depending on where you live, there's like a friendship program, and then there's job program. Some of the volunteer opportunities for the friendship program are to like be paired with someone with IDD. Some of the opportunities for the jobs program is to help people with their interview skills, like giving them practice. And then a volunteer opportunity for like leadership development is like looking over somebody's speeches and like giving them feedback to improve their presentations in writing, or just confidence in general. I will say personally that the YLC has really helped with that And is one of the reasons I'm able to do this presentation today, because when I met Garrett, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm so nervous with like just speaking in front of people, but definitely have improved over this past year or so. And that's thanks to opportunities like Mon Impact that give us this opportunity to share our information. Oh yes, the one thing I was gonna add now that I remember, the 10 tips that we talked about, we added that to our presentation because we felt that yes, it's for Best Buddies chapters, but it's actually information that you can use like anywhere and everywhere. So even though you guys are in different countries, we wanted to present that information so that you could take it back to your country and maybe as a tip to improve accessibility wherever you live. So
And the link that I put in the chat, that goes straight to Best Buddies international programs. It's basically a map that kind of gives you an idea of like where we're all located internationally. But unfortunately, due to how different countries operate with like websites and stuff, just about each country has their own website for Best Buddies. So there's like a Best Buddies website for Canada, and there's like another one for Best Buddies like Mexico. So if you are, depending on what your country, where you're from, I would search in like a web browser and just search Best Buddies in that country, and whatever the programs that we offer in that location should be able to pop up and provide you more information on that. Now, if you can't, for whatever reason, can't find any of that information, please reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to assist in any way possible. Oh, awesome. Let's see. I believe we have an Italy program. Let me pull that back up. I just had it. Let's see. Oh no, we don't have a program there yet, but we have a program on the all of the border countries all have a program in there, but we unfortunately don't have one yet there. That's very sad.
but don't worry, we're always expanding. So.
Yes, and that is something that so we do have expansion programs. So if we don't have a program in your state or your province or country, you can look into getting involved in our expansion program, because the odds are that they are near or already around you. So that is another way of getting involved as well.
Oh, one program I forgot to mention is that there's eBuddies, and so that means like just being like a pen pal online. So you could probably get involved in that way. And from what I understand, there's a lot of people with IDD that aren't paired because there's not enough participants without IDD participating. So that's definitely probably your first best bet to get involved in Best Buddies, and like a good first step in my opinion. That's actually how I got started with Best Buddies at first, and then I went to the YLC like 2 years later. So
Did y'all have any other questions or anything? Okay. Well, thank you all so much again for allowing the YLC this opportunity to present to y'all. And we are just really excited and really fortunate to have been able to partner with MUN Impact to host this conference with everyone. And I hope everyone has a great rest of y'all's day.
Thank you so much to Best Buddies YLC for this incredible presentation. Thank you so much for all of the great advice that you provided us and for the great insight. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much to Vanessa and Garrett for answering some of our questions. We really appreciate that. And thank you to all of the participants who attended this presentation. The link is in the chat if you are interested in learning more about future workshops with the Best Buddies and MUN Impact Equality Expo. And please do follow Best Buddies and MUN Impact on Instagram. Thank you guys very much for being here. Thank you again to Vanessa and Garrett for answering our questions, and to the YLC for this incredible presentation.
Ryan, before we leave, did you want to take a screenshot of everyone? I just know that that's something they've been doing in the other workshops. So
Absolutely, I'd be glad to. If everyone would like to turn on their camera, if you're comfortable with that, that would be incredible. Okay, awesome. I will, okay, smile and I'll take a picture now. Fantastic. Thank you guys very much for being here. Thank you again, Vanessa and Garrett. Thank you for reminding me about the picture, Vanessa.
you're welcome.
And fantastic. Thank you guys very much.